And I think part of what's happened is that the existence of an institution like the FDA has actually crowded out the rise of those alternative intermediary institutions. So you can't just measure it against the status quo, but what the status quo would have been or would be without the existence of that false blanket of security that the FDA provides. And I think you hit the nail on the head here. That blanket of security is indeed a false blanket of security. People talk about the effects of thalidomide many years ago. You're actually not going to hear as much in the press probably for the next 15 years. Eventually, it'll come around to it 20 years from now. But for the next 15 years, you're probably not going to hear about the adverse consequences by way of myocarditis or otherwise of an FDA-approved and government-mandated program, which is even worse than just a government-allowed program, which is what you had in the case of thalidomide and birth defects, which is the telltale example that they used to justify the existence of the FDA. And so my view, I guess my question I shared with my views, I'm curious for you, is it's hard to know, but what is your hypothesis of whether or not, on balance, the American health system and the patients who are the most important stakeholder in that system would be better, worse, or at least arguably unknown as to whether they'd be better off if there wasn't an FDA in the first place?
I think at the end, if you're talking about FDA 2024, I think that they'd probably be better off as a result of not having the FDA. And let's unpack that a little bit. You alluded to that the FDA is the be-all, end-all, and in many ways they are. So let me just talk a little bit about my field, cancer medicine. Through a number of different provisions, when the FDA approves a cancer drug, it is often mandated coverage by Medicare and Medicaid that we have to pay for it as well. And so what you do, as you point out, you crowd out anybody's ability to say, hey, maybe we could have this available to people, but maybe there needs to be, some serious copays for that. Maybe there needs to be some restrictions on who should get access to it because there's a lot of uncertainty. You're forcing the payer to pay. And so the moment you do that, you put all the chips in the FDA basket. The moment they get that drug approval, they know they're going to get a windfall of cash, and they have very little incentive, I think, to generate all the evidence that people may want. What would the world look like without the FDA? That's the question you pose. And I think you're absolutely right. I think people talk about as if it will be a free-for-all. There'll just be tons of products coming on the market and we won't know what's better. In many ways, it might be like the way the cellular phone market is. There's still fierce competition. There's a number of websites that are rating phones all the time. When you're thinking about buying a phone, particularly an Android phone, all these sites are rating them. There may be different groups of people who rate cancer drugs differently. I think I'm a very sort of a purist of evidence-based medicine. We would put out, we could arguably put out a set of guidelines. Some insurance companies may decide to go with me because they think, Prasad's guidelines are more evidence-based. They lead to more cost-effective healthcare. Other insurance companies might go with different guidelines, but you would get competition in the marketplace. And then you would allow people to see who's winning. You could actually assess it later and see, which standard actually leads to greater availability of drugs, better outcomes, less toxicity, lower costs, more time at home, which is what people want. We don't get to see that competition. And so in many ways, when we imagine a world without the FDA, it's easy to envision the boogeyman of just a free-for-all. That might not be what it is. And the last thing about thalidomide, I'd just say to your point, what was the story of thalidomide for the listeners? In the 1950s, late 1950s, thalidomide was approved in the United Kingdom, but notably there was one FDA reviewer who famously did not want that product available in the US market, and it was approved as a morning sickness medicine for pregnant women. In the UK, unfortunately, thalidomide it's a teratogen. It causes serious birth defects like the prevention of the development of the limbs. And so you had a lot of children born without their upper arms developed in the United Kingdom. In the United States, since we didn't approve it, we didn't have that phenomenon. Now, many people in response to that felt like that was a great example of why we need to strengthen the FDA. It led to the passage of the Kiefer-Harris amendments in the early 60s, and it gave FDA more authority in regulating drug products. But strictly speaking, it wasn't an example where the regulation, had it been in place prior, would have prevented thalidomide from coming on the market because it was an efficacy requirement that they added, and this was really a safety concern. So I think you're right about the story. It's not always told in the crispest way possible. I think there's more nuance to that story, as you note.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those, stories that are designed, there's only a couple of them really, but that's the one that's a classic case that any modern defender of the FDA will bring up, is the thalidomide case, actually aren't necessarily as powerful of a justification for the FDA as a safety gatekeeper as they claim it to be. The stories that don't get told are the countless other instances. I think the example you brought up in the case of COVID-19 is absolutely one of them. Going out of their way to not only approve more quickly, but a federal government that they're part of that went on to mandate something that literally caused heart defects, myocarditis, and other heart-related defects, cardiac defects, in patients for whom there was incremental, if no benefit whatsoever at all. That, I think, is something that we haven't yet reckoned with, which is also a consequence of having the FDA.